Today's episode, I'm going to talk about something that seems like it may be a little odd. What do my books have in common with Family Guy? Welcome back to the DL Jones channel. In this episode, I'm going to talk about what do my books have in common with the TV show Family Guy. Okay, so I'm not talking about every book that I have. I have several books. I want to say about 5 or 6 books. I'm not talking about every book that I have, but 2 in particular. The ones that I'm talking about is the one called Billet Hall, which is sort of like a thriller that takes place during slavery time, and my fantasy book, book 1 of Scepter of Truth. And those books have something very in common with the TV show Family Guy. And I noticed this myself a couple of months ago when I was watching Family Guy. A lot of times at nighttime when I'm about to go to bed, I will turn on something on TV, and I always will turn on something that I don't have to pay attention to. I just need some kind of noise in the house going on so that I can go to sleep, so it's not completely quiet. So I usually turn on a TV show, maybe something that I've seen a million times. And for a while there, I was going through Family Guy. I started in season 1, and I would play them every night, which of course I'd only get through maybe a half an episode before I actually fall asleep. But it'll play about 3 or 4 episodes before you get to pop up on the window. All the streaming services do this. That'll say, "Are you still watching?" And then of course, I'm asleep, so I never click the button, so it cuts off. So when I was watching Family Guy one night, it was one night where I did end up watching a few episodes in a row before I finally fell asleep. I noticed something about the format of the episodes, and almost every episode follow the same format. What they do is the show will start, and it would usually have a gag or a joke that starts off the episode. About the first 5 minutes of the episode will be based on that gag. But right when that gag is about to end, or the punchline for that gag is about to come across, the show will switch. It'll change directions. It'll turn into, that gag will lead into something else. And that something else that it leans into end up being what the episode is about. That's what the show changes to, and that's what the bulk of the episode end up being about. Well, almost every episode that I can think of kind of follows this same format of starting off with one joke and then leading into a completely different joke from where the episode starts. The 2 books that I mentioned, Billet Hall, which is my slavery thriller, and Scepter of Truth, which is my book 1 of my fantasy series, they both kind of follow that format. And I didn't do it on purpose. It's just the way I think about things. A lot of times when I come up with ideas for books, sometimes the way I come up with an idea is I'll have something in my mind and I'll think, what if you take this and put it with this? How would that be in this story? And you give them this story. And those 2 books are books that I use that kind of thinking with. And I'm going to go through and explain those 2 books and how that follows the same format of a typical Family Guy episode, even though the story content is completely different than what you would see on a episode of Family Guy. Maybe, I don't know, maybe there is an episode of Family Guy that would follow along the same lines as those 2 books. And if you want to hear some more information about my writing and my books and stuff, go ahead and sign up to my newsletter, the DLJonesBooks newsletter, and I will put that in the show notes. And actually the website is DLJonesBooks.com/subscribe. And that'll get you to where you can sign up for my newsletter. I only send out a newsletter like 2 times a month. And the newsletter talks about some of the same stuff I talk about on this channel, but a lot of it is more focused on my books. I know some of my video content here will be focused on my books, but the bulk of it isn't. Whereas on my newsletter, a lot of it is focused on my writing, my books, and other books you can buy and read and stuff like that. So that's DLJonesBooks.com/subscribe. Anyway, okay, so let's get to the books that I'm talking about. The first book that I'm talking about that I say have a lot of, at least the way it starts, has a lot in common with the TV show Family Guy, which is completely, you wouldn't think that would be the case, is my book, Billet Hall. This right here. Now, Billet Hall is a thriller, and it takes place during slavery, which, what does that have to do with Family Guy? How would that have anything in common with Family Guy? Well, let's take a look at Billet Hall, and I'll explain the plot of the story a little bit, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, Billet Hall takes place during slavery time, 1858, couple years before the Civil War. And basically, the story starts out with a plantation, a slave owner's plantation, where a slave owner, his father actually owns a plantation, but he runs the plantation. But his father wants to retire from the business, so he wants to sell all of his slaves and sell his plantation and retire to Georgia. So what happens is that the slave owner has to take all of the slaves to a big auction that's coming up and put them up for sale. Now, the slave master, the one that actually run the day-to-day of the plantation, he has kind of formed a bond with the slaves, and he kind of don't believe in, how slaves are treated, and he kind of treats his slaves differently than all of the other slave houses that's in the area. And they pretty much had it pretty good with him, because there's a lot of stuff he didn't believe in doing that a lot of the other slave owners did. If you were going to be a slave and during that time, and you were going to be on a plantation, that was the plantation that you would want to be on, you would want to live, compared to the other ones in the area. Well, this particular slave owner, he wanted to make sure that his slaves were taken care of when they were sold. So he kind of he did some research, and he found out about another plantation, which is Billet Hall, the name of the book, where that particular plantation had the same values and views on slavery as he did. Actually, they were a step further. They were even better as far as how they felt about slaves. So he met with them, and he arranged with them to purchase all of his slaves. He wanted to keep all of his slaves together. It was about 15 of them. He wanted to keep all of his slaves together, and he wanted to make sure that they went to a plantation that wasn't going to mistreat them, because they lived most of their lives on this plantation with him. And he knew that going to another plantation where the slave owners didn't treat them as well as he did may not work that well for them. He wanted to make sure that they was well taken care of. So he met up with the leaders of Billet Hall, made a deal with them for them to come to the slave auction and purchase all the slaves. Because of the rule of the land, they had to actually go there and purchase the slaves. They couldn't just buy them, before the auction, because they had rules where you can only sell slaves during official auctions or slave sales or slave trades or stuff like that. So Billet Hall had to send a representative to the town and go to the actual festival where they had this big slave trade and purchase the slaves, and they had to purchase all of them. Well, there was a mix-up with the slave trade, and what ended up happening was Billet Hall ended up only purchasing half the slaves. The other half ended up being purchased by another plantation, where it is known throughout the city that that plantation owner, the slave master, was really cruel to his slaves. He was really evil, bad. He whipped them, he damaged them, and he did a lot of stuff to them, that just made life a lot worse, especially worse compared to what these particular slaves were used to. And how brutal that new slave master was shown directly in the book. By as soon as he purchased the slaves, the first thing he did was started whipping one of the slaves, and just for things to come. So what happened with Billet Hall is that they kind of prepared for this. They knew that there may be a situation, back then, these towns, they kind of play by their own rules. And then when you had outline rules, they did a lot of sneaky stuff in the background to try to get their way. And Billet Hall, the representative from Billet Hall, knew that this would happen. So he sent in a person to try to solve this problem. This person was a 15-year-old slave girl named Marion. And what he did was he sent her in. He brought her along as if he was just a slave girl that was helping him out as he went along with his duties, enjoying the festival and all of that kind of stuff. But what he ended up doing was having the slave girl, Marion, sneak in with the slaves that went back to the original slave master's quarters, to prepare for their move to the new slave house. He had Marion sneak in their cart and ride back to the quarters with them. And in the middle of the night, she orchestrated a plan for them to escape and leave and travel across the state, I guess, because this happens in Virginia, and they end up in what is now West Virginia. At that time, West Virginia didn't exist, but where they were going was what is now West Virginia. So she had to help them escape and, take them along to Billet Hall so that all of the slaves will be back together again. Now that's where the story changes, because the story starts off like it's a typical slave story. You know, you have slaves dealing with being in slavery, getting whipped, dealing with slave masters and all of that kind of stuff. But once they escape the plantation house after the auction and they get to traveling, it turns into a survival story, a survival thriller. You know, now it's not so much that they're dealing with being slaves and dealing with trying to navigate the world of slavery. Now they're navigating the wilderness. They're trying to make it through tough terrain. They're trying to escape the weather, the environment, and all of that kind of stuff. While they do still have the slave masters, you know, just random bounty hunters and stuff looking for them, it's not a big part of the story anymore. Now the part is, can they survive until they get to the boat that's like miles and miles away that will take them to Billet Hall? But the thing that happens that they don't know about, they're unaware about for a large part of the book, is that there is a killer, a murderer, that's hunting them down and catching them and killing them one by one. You know, and at first they don't realize that this murderer is hunting them down. You know, he's just slowly catching up to them. He's following them. And whenever they come across any bounty hunters or slave traders or something like that goes to attempt to capture them, sometimes they'll end up finding those people dead and brutally chopped up and brutally murdered. And they don't know why that's happening. So that story starts off as a typical slaves, 12 years a slave type story, but it ends up and it changes directions quickly and it turns into pretty much a slasher, you know, with a killer, a Jason or Freddy Krueger or Michael Myers type character hunting them down, killing them off one by one. And they're in a race for time trying to stay away from the psychomaniac, so long enough that they can make it to the boat and then they'll be safe, you know, and the boat ride will take them to Billet Hall and they'll be reunited with the rest of the slaves that they were split from. Now, the second book that I have is Scepter of Truth. This is my fantasy book. And to be honest with you, if you go to Amazon and look for this book right now, the cover is actually different than this cover. I'm in the process of switching the covers of this whole series, and this is the newer cover. Let's see. This is the new cover that will replace what's there now. But this particular book, Scepter of Truth, the series is called The Inner Earth Chronicles. Now, the whole point of this series is that you have this woman. She's like a highly skilled, highly trained combat specialist, and she ends up in this realm, this magical realm, you know, where you got sword and sorcery and creatures and all of that kind of stuff. And she ends up in the middle of this squabble between a kingdom and their people. You know, there's a kingdom which they're on the verge of war. They have other nations that's threatening to attack them. And but the kingdom that she ended up falling in line with, they have a queen that half the people that live in that kingdom don't believe she should be the queen. So it's like the people are split, you know. So in the first book, she has to go and retrieve the Scepter of Truth, which is the name of the book. And what the Scepter of Truth is it's a scepter that has a gem on the top, that the gem is magical. And what happened is when the true heir to the throne holds that scepter, the gem lights, the gem shines, the gem glows, you know. So, and it was missing. It had gone missing for years and years and years, you know, before. Well, the queen wanted to unite the kingdom because she knew that there was a war on the way. So she sent Tangi, who is the main character, was the woman, the highly skilled combatant, the highly trained fighter and all of that kind of stuff. She sent her and a group of other people on a mission to retrieve the scepter. She got, you know, her spies and stuff had a word on where the scepter was hidden. So she sent, you know, Tangi and the rest of the crew to go retrieve it. Now, the part that makes this story remind me of how a Family Guy episode is that Tangi, which I left this out, Tangi is actually from, it's all fictional, but she's actually from what I would consider to be near present day. It's kind of futuristic a little bit, but it's more near present day. The story starts with her trying to join this military task force. It's like a high-tech military task force that used some kind of super experimental technology to help them fight whatever they're going to fight. But she's just applying to join. She's going through trials, trying to be a part of the team. And the reason why she's trying to be a part of that team is because when she was younger, when she was 15, her father went missing. Some people said it was a suicide. Some people just think he just went missing, but he just went missing. She didn't believe the story that the military gave her, so she kind of patterned her life after her father's life, which her father was a military man, and he was a really smart man, an inventor, a scientist. And so she followed everything that he did. She went to the same schools he went to. She tried to get similar degrees that he got. She got the same training, joined the same military and all of that kind of stuff. And then finally, she's about 30 years old now. She finally gets to a point where she can join the exact same military team that her father was a part of when he went missing. And they had closed the team down after her father went missing, and they was bringing it back together. They were having having all new people apply, try out for the position. You had to be a certain skilled soldier, a certain skilled military person. And she was that person because she trained her whole life trying to follow in her father's footsteps because she wanted to find out what happened to her father. So she's going through the training of this military team. And like all of this is present day. They're on a military base and they're going through military training and everything. And somehow during the training, she gets some information about her father. And then that leads her to a location. And that location has a portal that she goes through. And then she ends up getting trapped in the magical world. That's the similarity between Scepter of Truth and Family Guy. It starts off one thing, it starts off as sort of like a military investigation of this woman, trying to join some kind of military task force, and she's investigating her father's disappearance. And then it ends up where she's in the land of sword and sorcery and might and magic, and she's fighting creatures and she's dealing with people that uses magic and all of that kind of stuff. But those are my two books, and that's Scepter of Truth, and there's a whole series of 3 books of that already. I'm working on the 4th book now, which should come out sometime in 2021. But that's my 2 books that I think have a lot in common with Family Guy. It's weird, but it does. They have nothing to do with Family Guy, but they're pretty similar as far as they start off one way, and then as soon as you get going good in the first way, they change the directions and then go into what is essentially the plot of the story. And that's all I have for you today. And I appreciate you listening, and I'll see you next time.